Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook. I'm Robin Hunicke, your host this afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are on this lovely planet. I hope that you are well. I'm here today with Ben Wilson, who's a game designer that broke into the industry in a very interesting way. And we're going to be talking about Ben's progress as a game designer, how he's become more of an advocate in the space, not just for Black lives and Black designers, but for all people. And we're going to talk a little bit about how games themselves facilitate advocacy and the kinds of changes that we can make in our systems to encourage the participation of more diverse people. Thank you so much for listening. Here we are with Ben.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
I'm really excited to have you here, Ben. Why don't you do us all a favor and introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name is Ben Wilson. I'm a game developer from the UK. I have kind of done a mix of indie and AAA stuff over my career, and now I'm kind of transitioning back to full-time indie. But
Woo!
Yeah,
That's so exciting. So how did you first get started in video games? Were you someone who had always thought you'd become a game developer? Were you someone who kind of stumbled into it? Was it deliberate? Was it accidental? What was your process like?
Oh, it was like total tumble into the industry. It was not. I kind of grew up not really thinking. I mean, I guess you hear this a lot where people just assume that oh, that's not a job that I could do. And it wasn't until maybe my early 20s where I was like, oh, games is interesting, isn't it? And then it took another few more years where I'd kind of already graduated and kind of gotten a job at I'd gotten a graduate job at the management consultancy. So very not games.
Oh, wow, I was going to say that sounds like the exact opposite of games, or maybe opposite of fun games.
Yeah, it's the opposite of games. And I picked up Unity at that time. It was, I guess, maybe 2013, 2014, and just started kind of teaching myself how to make video games. And then after maybe 1 or 2 years of doing that, I started just flinging games online and just taking part in game jams and just kind of enjoying the kind of process of oh, I can just kind of be creative and put this out there, and then people will see it and just kind of enjoy my little thing for 5 minutes. And then it was in that kind of phase that I live in Nottingham in the UK, and I didn't live here at the time.
I've been there several times for the festival there.
Game City?
Yeah.
So bad news. They don't do that anymore here.
I know.
Yeah,
But it
really
was fun.
tragic. I missed. But that was the first time I ever showed a game in public was at one of those. It was Game City 2014, and just the feeling of seeing that kind of, I don't know, seeing people enjoy your game in person. It's just it's a very nice kind of experience to have, and it was very motivating to oh, maybe okay, this is the thing that I enjoy. I had kind of been searching for my teens and my early 20s for but what do I want to do though, and just kind of going through and doing kind of sensible options and not really having a passion. And at that point I realized, oh, it's video games. Oh yeah, this is great.
No such thing is really normal in video games. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, so from that point, I kind of kept taking little games to shows and expos, and at one point a curated kind of museum kind of exhibition. And yeah, it just kind of became a really nice part of my life to like make these games and then put them online and then take them to shows and just kind of have that, like, I guess it's like really direct feedback, and that's like always kind of motivating. And so eventually I quit my job and kind of had this discussion with my partner at the time, who I'm like super grateful for being just very encouraging in this way. I was kind of grappling with the issue of like, oh, I kind of want to do like game stuff, but like, I don't know, I still don't know if there's a career in that, and I don't know how to, like, outside of doing like these kind of experimental kind of weird like small games that I don't think would sell, but I like doing them, and that's, I don't know, I don't really know what to and she was just like, okay, we're young and we don't have like financial encumbrance right now, and we can move in with my parents and we can just kind of live kind of tight, you know, like not spending much, and just see if it works and just give it a year. And
that's really great that they were able to put you that way and encourage you.
And like that's an opportunity that not everybody gets, and that like year was super important for like just kind of firstly getting better at the craft, but also just kind of developing my like taste as a developer. And I think I would probably have just gone back to doing something that I was doing before and just kind of keeping this as a hobby, or just stopping if I hadn't like had the opportunity. And so, yeah, I'm super grateful to her for kind of letting me chase this dumb dream and seeing if it turned into anything.
It's so great too that Game City was able to be a place where you were able to show your game. Were you in like official capacity? Did you get invited and submit, or was it like more like there was like a cool place where people were hanging out showing games? Like, what was that like back then?
Yeah, so I at the time they just kind of had open submissions. They kind of, I think the show was in like October or September or something, and basically they just had open submissions throughout the whole summer where you could just show them your game, and they usually just say yes because that's the kind of show that they are, and they just kind of make space for it. And so you just have this huge kind of eclectic selection of just games from all sorts of kinds of developers, from like just from everywhere. And it was really nice being in that kind of company. I felt very at home with all of these other games that kind of weren't kind of like traditionally what you'd think of as like, oh, that's a video game. That's the, you know, you buy that on Steam for $10. It felt like a place for things on the fringes, and that was really nice to see.
Yeah, it's actually really important to give people the opportunity to see that games are more than just what's massively marketed, right? Like,
yeah,
the key to getting people to contribute is that we create spaces, and I think curate, you know, opportunities so that people can get that feeling that you got, which is like, oh, I can be part of this community, that it isn't just like, you don't just have to have made The Last of Us to be able to make a video game for other people. And in fact, actually, you can make video games for people who may not even know that they want them yet, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like one of the really nice things about that event is that it was just kind of open to the general public. I don't think they charged for tickets. They just kind of like opened the doors, and it was like, hey, come in with your families and just like bring kids and like just come in off the street and just look at these games. And so there was just a real like mix of like, it wasn't just gamers at this show. It was like people from all kind of walks of life. Yeah. It was just kind of regular people. And that was really nice. Because yeah, you do kind of, I did kind of get a lot of like, oh man, this is not what I thought video games were like, which is nice.
That's really fantastic. So you took this year off, and you're like, did you just start making prototypes? Like, what did you do?
Yeah, not even prototypes. They were like the style of game that I love to. I realize. So one of the things that I realized in this year is that like, when it comes to my indie games, like I have a short attention span when it comes to like, I just want to make this small idea and just kind of, okay, I'm going to work on it for a month and then just like, it's done. And that idea is kind of spent and I've finished it and next thing.
Okay,
and so I was,
give us an idea of one of these early games. What was it?
Oh, sure. Me and a couple of friends made a game called TV Trouble, which is it's kind of like this WarioWare style like mini puzzles where you're on this kind of like factory floor with a conveyor belt in front of you and like 1950s style old TVs come up one by one and they're all like kind of, they're switched on, but their like signal is fuzzy and crackling and you've got to like, you've got like buttons and dials and the aerial and stuff like that. And you've kind of got to manipulate them in such a way that the signal returns back to normal. And like the way you can kind of tell that you're doing the right thing is that the signal like fades kind of in and out. And like, that was really fun. And we got like a bunch of archive TV footage from the 60s, like actual TV footage to put in the game. Yeah, that game has a really like nice nostalgic kind of place in my heart because like just through making the game over that like couple of weeks we were just kind of immersed in this weird like television of yesteryear. Yeah, commercials were just really weird back then. Most of the footage was commercials and it was just like
cigarettes and stuff.
Basically, yeah, cigarettes, beer, kind of misogynistic tire commercials.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, just not really not
not great.
Not great, but like
problematic ads and giving you trouble. So kind of connecting the idea that you're tuning in, but also making you aware of what maybe people were tuning into back then.
Yeah, and the game kind of had this like neat push-pull of like, it's this kind of against the clock thing, so you're trying to like fix it and done and fix it and done, and every time you click done you get another TV and you've got to keep going, but like you kind of just want to like watch the TV for a bit because like sometimes there's something interesting and it's like, are those monkeys? What? And I enjoy the kind of like, you know, you're playing the game, but really you're just kind of like taken by the whatever's going on the screen. And
so you have this short attention span philosophy that's like you want to do something and get it done. And so it's going to be like a relatively bite-sized snack in terms of gameplay. Is that kind of where you were at that time?
Yeah. I mean, like for that game, as an example, you could probably like play that and kind of have your fill of it in a 20-minute play session or so, or less. Like you could like play 10 to 20 minutes and get the gist of it and be like, cool. I mean, I don't know, or I hated that, but you know, either way, you get the full thing of it.
Yeah. So you were doing this, and then you're like, okay, I'm taking this year, and I'm going to just keep doing this. And did you think like at the end of that year, I'll just go back and do whatever? Like it was just like, okay, that'll be it?
Basically, yeah. Well, I kind of didn't know what was going to happen. I just kind of, took the leap and just kind of kept working and realized that like I don't super enjoy the business side of making like kind of tiny indie games that really aren't like super marketable.
Does anyone enjoy that?
I guess not. I mean, there's probably people who enjoy that. I don't want to.
I don't know anyone that does because it's a really hard business.
Yeah, for sure. But also, like, development is a different kind of prospect when you're making a product versus like when you're just putting a thing out there. Like, you know, you have to have, if you're making a PC game, you have to have like options that mean that you can kind of play it on different, like you have scalability settings and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And stuff like you've got to put like menus in that do all sorts of like, you know, you don't have TLCs like you have for consoles, but it's like, you know, a kind of step up in terms of like.
And you didn't want to be doing those things. You didn't want to be wasting your time on that stuff. And so you were focusing on the creative. And then like, as you started to do more stuff and focus on creative and going into game jams, did you find that this was actually like, oh, there's more people like me here, you know, that I'm not the only one?
Yeah, so I kind of ended up doing game jam through you familiar with the Idle Thumbs podcast?
I am familiar with the Idle Thumbs podcast, actually.
So I'm a big Idle Thumbs fan. The forum community kind of eventually decided it would be fun to like just organize a game jam this one time, and that eventually spun off into like just this kind of regular thing that we just did, which I kind of at some point ended up just kind of becoming the co-organizer of. And that was just a really nice community of people who were kind of, well, there's a mix of people. There were people who were like me, who were just kind of like novices who were kind of just interested in like making stuff and kind of just like figuring themselves out creatively, really. And then there were people who had just like never made a game before, and like the jam was called Wizard Jam, and we would basically run it over 2 weeks, which I think like I'm seeing that a lot more nowadays, but it wasn't super common back then. You kind of had like the weekend model, which was like popular back then, but like we ran it over yeah, basically. But we ran it over 2 weeks just because like people have lives, and I don't kind of the prospect of like running a jam like you're just kind of crunching over a thing is not super attractive to a lot of people, especially if they have things going on in their lives.
Super not inclusive. And as someone who actually helped pioneer the first game jams, it took me a while to realize, like, even just as a person who had helped build one, how much there was in the process itself that kind of scared, muggles essentially away from trying to do it in the first place. So it's cool that you called it a Wizard Jam and that you made it 2 weeks long. That's really rad.
I mean, it's like you really just kind of assumptions are baked into everything, right? And that's like a kind of good example of that. Like we didn't realize what kind of effect that would have. Like we kind of had a like, oh, it would be just more convenient for people, and that was the kind of only thought we gave it. And then we just kind of got a large amount of people who were like, well, I don't know, I just thought I'd try it out, and I just kind of it just seemed kind of approachable and nice, and that was like a really
so stressful.
that was just like a really nice side effect for us that we then just kind of like in future jams we just kind of lent into that and just kind of promoted that as a thing. It's like this is a kind of jam that is organized like around your life rather than the other way around. And there were a lot of like really lovely people in that community who I'm still friends with a lot of them, and it's really nice to kind of I didn't study games in like kind of a formal kind of education sense, but it felt like being in kind of like a graduating class with all of these people, just because you kind of watching all of them kind of develop over the course of 5 years. And it's really nice to kind of look back on all of that stuff. Occasionally I'll go back to like the itch.io archives of all of these jams and just kind of see, because like it's nice to do that with your own stuff because you kind of just get to see your own development, but it's also nice just like seeing that from a person you're close to, who you've kind of been working kind of next to or like kind of adjacent to over that same time, and just seeing how they also kind of develop. And it's just really nice. And I'm really a fan of like communities coming up together, and that just kind of felt like a really nice example of that.
Well, and that's actually what I was going to say. It's like, the idea of community was so crucial to Game City, and to the early indiecades that happened in Culver City. And I think one of the things that was happening around this time frame, like 2014 to 2018, was that people were really starting to ask questions about what were the assumptions in the indie community around participation in festivals and access to, for example, being able to take a whole weekend off. Like that also assumes that you have a 9-to-5 job that's Monday through Friday, which not everybody has. And like, there's just a lot of these kind of assumptions that were baked into the early processes of being independent, that were just as much about the fact that that was a relatively small and privileged group of people that could do it. And so as you were like moving through the Wizard Jam and then onto these other activities, were you able to really find a community that you felt like you were helping to build and grow on your own, like sort of almost like a next iteration of independent game development?
I mean, it kind of, I guess I wouldn't have called it at the time that like we are the next generation of game developers, but it was really kind of empowering to see a group of people, many of whom just wouldn't have been developers. They just wouldn't have gotten into it if they just kind of, the kind of combination of kind of things that happened, didn't happen. And like, it's like around this kind of similar time, just tools were becoming more accessible and like kind of free, I guess. Like Unity was becoming free, Unreal Engine was like out there now. And just kind of the stuff that the barriers to entry that were kind of prohibitive from just letting you like, think, oh, I'll just try this for a weekend and see. Which we're just gone at that point. And so it was kind of like a nice confluence of events, really. And yeah, like it's really nice. It was really nice to kind of be ushering in a group of developers who were not like traditionally like from games. Like one of my like very good friends from like that community who I like still talk to like semi-frequently came from like aerospace engineering, and then he like came from that and decided he wanted to make like short narrative games in the style of like Blender games, and that's like the thing that he like discovered he loved. Which is just amazing, and he was just like amazing at it, and it was just like like seeing somebody like discover like, oh, I love this and I'm great at it, and this is the thing that I love, and like now he still does some work in that field, but he also dedicates some of his week to indie games, and yeah, that's like just really, really nice. And I don't think like, in that initial wave of like indie games, I don't think there were as many stories of that. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't around making games at that time, but like,
yeah, well, I was, and I think you're correct. I mean, I think what we saw with Experimental Gameplay Workshop around this time was that we started to have to really ask a lot of hard questions about the difference between the kinds of games we wanted to include in the showcase and the kinds of games that always were like big plays on screen at the conference, like at GDC, right? And I remember that Daniel and I had a really pointed conversation like 2014 and 2015 talking about games that we wanted to put into the showcase that were like more along the lines of activism or like a piece of art. They might not necessarily have like brand new physics mechanics or like work with a really complex rendering technique, which was often like a lot of early indie games were about engine level innovation. And it was like we moved from engine level innovation into thinking about design and like the engagement loops of games differently. And then we moved into a place where it was just about the content. And there was a big discussion that happened at that time. Like, well, is it really an experimental game if it's just a new story being told and the mechanics are not, essentially like new to the games industry? And we sort of started to feel like, yeah, actually there needs to be room for innovation that isn't just mechanical. And that in and of itself was a big discussion among game designers. And I think this is was the beginning of that,
Yeah, it really like, I guess a conversation like that really makes you examine the way you think about like, what are the valued properties of like game design, or like the kind of things you're choosing to like showcase, or the things you're choosing to like deem as like innovative, I guess.
Yeah, well, there was actually a big history of things that were like things that the Experimental Gameplay Workshop had shown off, and they were essentially, a lot of them were physics games. It just happened to start off with a physics engine, and I think that kind of drove it in a certain direction. And around that same time, also thinking about teaching games and how they worked, I think there were similar discussions happening in the education summits and thinking about, well, what could we be doing to not just broaden access to the knowledge, but actually, do a critique of the knowledge and understand that, like, for the longest time, this was a very small group of people that were hobbyists and that they were approaching it a very specific way due to all of their own cultural baggage and their own assumptions about what was entertainment. You know, many of them come from the military, and military simulation and military games were kind of the bread and butter of the games industry for a very long time. And so that in sports, and when you really start to look away from those things and towards what games could be, that's when it gets really exciting. So that was a really crucial time, I think, in the scene. So you gave this talk at Developers of Color last year. You were working on this game. Did you make it like personally yourself on your own while you were working, or was this in the period when you were working on games as an individual?
So it's actually, the talk is actually about kind of a handful of games that I made over that kind of period of, like,
okay, great.
I don't know, like a year and a half, 2 years, that kind of had this running theme. I kind of had this, like, obsession that I wanted to get out of my system, really, of, like, describing just kind of personal experience. So it all kind of comes from, I got diagnosed with dyspraxia pretty late on, compared to when you would usually. I got diagnosed at 22, I think.
And can you explain for the audience who doesn't know maybe what dyspraxia is? Like, what are the symptoms and how did you get diagnosed?
It's a cognitive developmental disorder, which it's kind of adjacent to dyslexia. It's kind of related, and a lot of people who have one actually have both in some way, and there's kind of, it operates on a spectrum. So you can kind of have severe or kind of mild kind of case of it, but it's really a disorder that kind of affects the way you organize thoughts, and that can kind of manifest itself in a I mean, the main thing it manifests itself as is in a kind of disconnect between your, like, kind of motor functions and your brain. And so an example that a lot of dyspraxic people have when they're talking about, like, just the day-to-day kind of sensation is that, like, typing is just a thing that you hate. You just kind of grow to hate typing because, like, it is just an exercise in your brain working at one speed and your body working at another speed, and they're never quite matching. And so you're, like, constantly trying to slow down and, like, your speed of thought to match kind of what you can, like, manage your body. And it also kind of, you know, it comes in some other ways, like sense of direction and ability to kind of, like, navigate space is another way. Myriad kind of ways that it kind of affects the day-to-day in kind of small and large ways. And, like, I have, in my case, it's like pretty manageable. It's not like a thing that, like, gets in my way often. It's just kind of a thing that, like, has colored my experience with, like, just various things in a way that I just kind of assumed that everybody, like, had. And it was only when I got diagnosed for this at, like, in my 20s that I realized, oh, hey, this is actually, like, a unique thing that I kind of want to talk about. And I kind of took this thing for granted that I, you know, had this, like, difficulty with certain tasks and this kind of brain frustration of not being coordinated and kind of feeling kind of clumsy in that way that is kind of hard to talk about. And that was around the time that I was beginning to make games. I was kind of thinking about this and kind of just fascinated by these experiences that we have that we are just kind of day to day and so kind of small and or not necessarily small, but kind of, they're not really, like, experiences you have words for.
Because are they too organic to have words for them?
Yeah. Like, I really can't kind of describe in words, like, the feeling of not being able to kind of navigate a space because your kind of brain clouds up in a way that kind of just obscures the directions to the place that you've been to 100 times, or the way that you're typing an exam because you're at school or something like that, and your brain is ready to go with all the facts and all the kind of things you want to talk about, and your hands are just not cutting it, and you're kind of frustrated at the like mistakes you're making and having to like slow down your brain to kind of let your kind of earlier thoughts come out, and then that's kind of causing like it's hard to talk about. And so like I kind of got obsessed for a while with like making these games that kind of bit off a piece of these experiences like one by one. And it was at that time when I was kind of showing my games at like small shows and expos and kind of local events that I really got a nice kind of experience from letting people play these games that had been designed in a way that kind of it like amplified kind of a aspect of my experience in a way that you could kind of, it was like a kind of metaphor for like actually kind of having that like experience day to day, but kind of in this like abstract kind of video game environment where, you know, one of the games I made is it's a game called Button Frenzy, and it's basically it's a game where you have like this really kind of simple task of like you're following these button instructions, but it's a incredibly easy to comprehend task, but it's kind of coming at you at a pace that is kind of uncomfortable. And when I made that game and put it in front of people, they were kind of making the kind of face that I make when I'm just like when I'm just kind of doing stuff that is like a little bit too much to handle. And that like felt like a real like it felt really empowering
in them. Yeah,
absolutely. It felt really empowering to kind of be able to relate that experience that I'd had so much trouble relating. And so I just kind of kept trying that. And, you know, I made a game about like dyspraxic people often have a kind of really frequent mixing up of left and right, which is kind of like, I can't explain why that like happens. Like I don't really understand why that happens, but
I have that actually, so I totally know it. It's like I actually have to hold my hand up in front of myself when I'm talking to someone about which way to turn and look for the L in my hand. If I don't do it, I always say the wrong one. It's really annoying. And it's made so many people in my life very frustrated.
Well, yeah, and it's something that is like, it's never the thing that like, you know, it's never a moment that is worth like talking, oh, I just had this weird thing where I couldn't tell. It's just like a thing that happens in quiet moments to yourself where you're like, turn the key the wrong way again, because you always turn the key the wrong way. And like, so I made a game about like, it's called Concentric. It's about moving through a space that is made out of concentric rings that you move between. And really, when you kind of deconstruct it, the gameplay is basically like Frogger, or kind of a minimalist take on Frogger, but operating in like a circle. And that is enough of a alteration to that formula for the whole left-right thing to kind of become a issue when you're playing. Your relative left is not what you think it is, and it's kind of a fast-paced game, and you're kind of relying on muscle memory more than you kind of assume you are, and so like the experience of playing that game and making the mistakes that your brain knew would be a mistake, but your hand just went and did it anyway, and like playing the game and kind of conquering that kind of sense and becoming like familiar with that sense almost, and like it normalizes that experience while you're playing it. And
I was going to say, it's like procedural rhetoric. It actually is. It's a rhetorical statement about, you know, what your experience is, but you can only get it if you do the experience itself.
Yeah, There's something powerful in that, but there's also something really playful in that I enjoy. It's it's like, do you ever, when you were a kid, like, you're not supposed to do this now because it's like really bad for you, but did you ever like inhale a helium balloon and just like
totally. I've
mess
done it
around with like having a high-pitched voice?
Absolutely. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's it's playful in that sense of like stepping into an experience that is not usually your experience and just kind of playing in that space for a little bit. And then you can step out, but it's just kind of, you're just experiencing for that moment. And I really kind of enjoy that quality.
When I was just moving back to San Francisco and starting to teach, and then designing the program that I teach at UC Santa Cruz, I ended up teaching a few what I called autobiographical game design courses that were specifically focused on found objects or minimal technical requirements. So essentially, like, you're supposed to build a game about something that's on your mind a lot, that's personal to you, and then use either found objects or mod other games, or go to the flea market and buy like $10 worth of random things and use those as your implements for the game. Mm-hmm. And the first year that I taught it, I had a student that wanted people to understand what it felt like to be on the spectrum. So she took a game of Set, which is a matching game, where you match, shapes, colors, and numbers of things, and combos basically. And then she gave everyone a card that said, you can do all of the actions in the game except this one. Like, you can't match sets of triangles, or you can't match purple things. And if there's a set on the table and it has those things in it, you're not allowed to call it out. And that was the only constraint, was just that you couldn't sort of quote unquote see certain kinds of connections. And the way that the game worked was everyone had one of these except one person who had none of them. And then anyone who was playing would have to play with their constraint, but then also point out when someone else they thought had a constraint. If they could figure out by watching other people what their constraint was, they could out them. Yeah. And then they could get the points that person had won, and that other person would be out of the game. And it was really about passing and feeling like you don't want other people to know what your quote unquote constraint or handicap is, and that your disability feels like a constant companion because you're not hiding it, but you're also trying not to surface it, right? Like, if you deliberately try to hide it, then you out yourself, but but you're trying to avoid situations where it can be noticed. And I thought it was so incredibly nuanced, like a really fantastic design,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
I love the designer, and because it's not my work, I won't out them here, but like, I really appreciate them, and I think they're a fantastic person and also a great contributor. And so they've actually been able to matriculate into the games industry. And I think that it's on the back of this different focus of being able to see things differently. And I love that idea of building games that convey that experience. And to your point, you can do it with a fairly simple game, but you do have to think a lot about it. So like, the games that you make might be short, but the labor involved in making them is actually I always think of it as being very difficult to make an elegant, sort of very sort of focused design, I guess. Like, to do procedural rhetoric really is it's very hard.
Yeah. And like, going back to, like, it's really, that's something that I've really come to appreciate design, that like, it's almost making a metaphor out of systems. And I think that's like fascinating.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah. And again, like, this is a thing that I keep on saying now, but like, your example that you just gave, it's another example of a game that is like, it has this kind of autobiographical quality, which I love, but it's not narrative in that way. It's in that way that you kind of delivering an experience and not a kind of story.
Yeah, you can only know that experience, and you can only tune to it if you've had it. And I think that's like, I think we can sort of think about it in terms of what's been going on in the world lately. But the kind of the idea of diversity and inclusion is often like people think like, oh, well, it's a person of this background or this color or this gender or this or that. And actually the way that we try to see it at Phenomena is that it's actually about your experience, because your experience determines whether or not you can communicate things through design in that way. Like, it's very difficult to design a game like that unless you've had, dyspraxia. Like it's not something that I could design, right? Like, I might have trouble with directions, but I don't have this particular syndrome. So it was like, I wouldn't be good at doing it. And your unique experience of you enables you to do that work, which is why it's so important to continue to, to kind of, I think, to keep getting new experiences into the fold and like making things this way. Like, I love games like that, actually. I really do. And I hope that people appreciate them like they appreciate fine food, and other things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this is what I am excited for in games, as creators, as people kind of get tools in their hands and come at it from different angles of like non-traditional angles of like, I want to make a game that is like the game that I like. I want to make a game that speaks to my experience and kind of, I don't know, I want to share something about myself in this experience. This is the thing that I love.
Yeah. It's when games move into the territory of art and human expression, because they're no longer about, I just want to build like an interaction machine that monetizes people the way that it has specifically this particular design has monetized people in the past, right? Like that's making a business out of an interactive system. And then there's, I want to use the interactive system to communicate something really different, which is, it's just a completely different perspective. And I think one that's just, it's endemic to a designer. In many ways, I think actually the barrier to entry comes down and you get more people trying. But it's very rare to meet a game designer. Like, I think that game designers are quite exceptional in some ways, because game designers specifically think about rules and the way that rules create systems. And doing that kind of systemic game design, specifically systems design, is a really interesting, but a very hard and very introspective job if you want to innovate the way you're talking about. So that's awesome that you have not only like found a place for yourself to do it, but that you had the courage to share those things, through that medium. It's truly, truly great. So because there was this question being asked repeatedly, really, about what it means to make games and what games are and what makes like game content. And then there are people that are coming into the scene with these new tools that were being made more available and more people were able to express themselves through gaming. I think there was this moment in like the middle there, like maybe 2017, 2018, when suddenly there was an explosion of small content that was really interested in being seen and heard, but not necessarily commercial. And as that kind of proliferated, I think it created a lot of opportunities for people to express themselves. But then the question was kind of like, well, are they going to actually be able to get jobs in the games industry? And I think where we are now is that we're seeing that like, between like say 2017 and 2020, there hasn't been a sudden like massive diversification of the kinds of people that are participating in games on a day-to-day level as a business, even if there is as a culture. And, I was just curious, like, do you think that that's a problem, or do you think that that's okay and that we just need to figure out a way to, sort of as the way you put it earlier, to make the business of making small indie games a sustainable business again? Or do you think that we should be doing something more organized and like just trying to get more diverse perspectives into the larger industry? Because I have an opinion, but I'm really curious about yours.
Yeah, I'm definitely of the mind that in the indie space and the AAA space it's just two different worlds right now, like culturally. I guess to like the last part of my story with regards to like that year I spent out in indie is I realized at the end of that year, like, oh, it'd be really nice to like have a regular paycheck again. That would be like really great right now. Actually just kind of like, just as a kind of punt, applied to some studios like in the area, and actually like got an interview, and then just got that job somehow, because I had like just kind of inadvertently made myself hiring material by like making these little games. That was just like, that's what you call a portfolio, it turns out. But like that was like, I feel like that that benefited me because of the style of games that I made. It was like there was kind of a clear line from that kind of game of like small and experimental, but still juicy, arcadey, kind of actiony, adjacent kind of games. And so, yeah, like for me, it was a like I had this opportunity to like, oh, I can kind of join the larger industry and kind of keep this like going. I can like stay involved in this industry and kind of be a part of it long term. But I definitely feel like that is not like that is the exception. Definitely not the rule. I've met like very few people who have had like similar stories of coming from indie into like games industry writ large.
Yeah, it's actually almost unheard of. It seems like
it's super kind of a rare kind of thing. And when I say indie, I'm kind of using shorthand for like the kind of zero budget indie that like I was, you know, the like experimental, just kind of scrappy, I'm gonna put this thing on a page and just put it out there sort of thing. Like indie as a like larger indie exists and is a kind of separate thing, but like and yeah, that's like a thing that I've kind of grappled with as I've been working in the industry. And like one of the things that I've kind of internally been trying to work on is like trying to shift those kind of perspectives towards people who are making games kind of on the fringes and aren't coming into games through the like traditional means, like through like formal education, that sort of thing. Because it's like a huge blind spot where it comes to like hiring and recruitment in large studios. That's just not a place where they're looking. Studios will often have like the colleges and universities on speed dial and be looking in kind of those places and looking at places where you would kind of hire, you know, you see it on the you kind of see it on, I mean, it's a kind of a often talked about thing, but like when you look at an entry level job listing for like video games, it's often like, well, I don't know how I would get to this.
It seems like 4 years industry experience or, you know, or these like really heavy portfolio needs. And I think that like your point that you organically developed a portfolio on the fringes, but that was still in the realm of like, I'm making games because I like game mechanics and I like enjoying the feeling of like putting these mechanics together in a small sketch and then feeling how they interrupt one another or they interact with one another, right? Like that was, to me, that is the fundamental quality of a game designer that you want. But that's not always what we look for when we put up our job posts.
Yeah, and even as in the case of applying for that job that I like ended up getting, even then I felt like they were kind of taking a chance on me. Like I didn't fill all of the requirements in that listing. Like I had never done design documentation before. Are you kidding? I had never kind of been exposed to that like formal, you know, capital I industry, like organized side of games before. And that's like often a requirement for just entry. And I think like if you're not coming at it from like a formal background of like being educated in that way and kind of prepared for working in the industry, it's just kind of hard. It's just kind of hard to like know where to come in, really.
Well, and then if you look at something like Roblox, which I'm obsessed with right now, and you look at the kinds of games that get made in the Roblox universe, there's some really interesting, weird things that can be made. You know, there are walking simulators, there are, you know, obstacle courses and platformers. There are games that mimic, you know, modern shooter mechanics. And as the community of children and young adults that has access to this relatively robust networking tool that has a gameplay engine attached to it, it grows. it's like really fascinating to me to think that like maybe in 10 years, I'll be retired and you'll be doing this podcast and you'll be interviewing a Roblox developer who's made a game like Build Your Boat for Treasure or Adopt Me, you know, these games that are really very different than what I think you or I would say are mechanically interesting experiences. And yet they're super popular, right? There's like something about the democratization of tools and platforms that eventually kind of, I mean, who knows, but maybe it leaves the AAA industry behind. Maybe that becomes a scene that's similar to opera, you know,
Sure.
compared to hip hop or, you know, TikTok. maybe there's a continuum there too, you know. I mean, and it does. I mean, maybe this is not the case for you, but does it seem to you like things are really speeding up? Because that's how it seems to me. It seems to me that I broke in at like 1995-ish, 1999.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time I hit 2015, there was like a serious change happening in the industry. And there was a change that happened when we had online stores. And then there was this change that happened with democratization of tools. And I feel like it's already happening again. I feel like the half-life of those changes has gotten smaller and smaller. But I'm an old lady. So is that true? Do you feel the same way?
I mean, like for the time that I've been involved in games in the sense of like paying attention to games, yeah, like even in like the last decade or so of video games, like yeah, it definitely feels like. I mean, there's a thing that I have. There's a thing that I say, which is like I'm really fascinated to see what the people who are 10 years old now, what games they are making when they are like even my age. Are they going to look back at like the 2010 era and like jokingly say, oh yeah, there were just like 6 kinds of video games and that was it. And like everything is kind of busted out so kind of far now and like everything is... Because yeah, like I've seen games like looked at as this incredibly like stratified, like, you know, rigid in terms of like genre and content kind of medium to something that like, I mean, at first there was just kind of, we had this point where there was just like, oh, we've just discovered some more genres, but then we got into this point where like genre didn't like mean anything anymore, I guess, because like that's just like you can only get so far by describing something in genre because there's just like so much cross-pollination in terms of influence and kind of style. And that's like, I mean, I hope that just kind of continues. And like, the generation of developers that is kind of influenced by Roblox and Minecraft and kind of that style of open-ended game that has like that kind of extensibility and like creative kind of, it's just kind of asking for your creative input. Yeah, heck yeah. I can't wait.
It's like, to me, the difference is like, we've gone from being a place where it's like, you have to go to school and learn all these techniques. And like, for example, being a chef, you know, like if you wanted to be a really high-end chef years ago, you probably had to go and get taught by another high-end chef. And then there were schools that got developed. And then eventually there got to be the point where people started to do experimentation. And then at some point it blossomed into a place where it was like, wow, if you have a unique approach to food, and you do one thing really well and very interestingly, that can be a business for you, right? And I think that's definitely been where games has been going. I also kind of wonder if, and maybe this is just because of COVID and, you know, George Floyd and the most recent stuff with Me Too in the games industry, I kind of feel like there's just been this incredible amount of churn and uncertainty that's occurred all around us over the last 4 months that is like waking people up to the fact that things maybe weren't good before for everybody and that some people are really shocked by this. And that when you look at like, if you watch, like I was watching Chef's Table the other night and just like, there are so many things about late stage capitalism that are true for like a high-end chef and like a fancy restaurant that like just have been completely exploded like in the last 4 months. Like they're just like, it seems like almost like a chapter has closed. And I'm wondering if like maybe that's happening with games too, you
Yeah,
know,
it
like
does feel like that. Yeah.
like we're on the edge of it, you know?
Like you were saying with high-end like look at all the stuff that happened with Bon Appetit in the last like month or so, where like,
Yeah, trash fire,
yeah.
just a nightmare.
And yeah, I don't know, like games as like a kind of large AAA industry just seems so like, this might be another generational thing where like games in that kind of style feel so like monolithic and kind of just kind of large, that I try to picture what a world past that looks like, and I just kind of, I just don't even know. And like that's my like kind of weird generational trappings showing, and that's the thing that like the people after me are going to bust open, I guess. But like I am really kind of quietly hopeful for like a shift in the way that like the existing power structures kind of are, I mean, re-examined, and like kind of hopefully enough of those conversations are happening at enough like places that some things can kind of change in the way that like we look at the creation of games and the people who get to make games and the people who are kind of seen as valuable in the game space.
You know, it's interesting. I've been thinking about it from the perspective of the move between a broadcast mechanism where we had all these systems that were designed to put one person in charge of disseminating information to other people. So like you look at like television news or newspapers, like the ads from your TV Trouble game, right? Like those
Sure.
kinds of communications came from a world where there was no such thing as broadcast television or radio, and then it became a thing. And we leaned really hard on that idea of experts and like people that were leaders. And like as we've moved into the internet and created a more networked approach to information and big data has emerged, there's a completely competing mechanism, right? Which is the dissemination of many, 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 many small things to a massive number of people, such that things kind of anneal up as they get more attention from people, right? So the things that get the most attention tend to get the most visibility. And that has had a bunch of impacts, not just on games, but on marketing of games and the ecosystems that games make money from. It's just really interesting to think about the idea of designs being sourced that way, like as they are in a Roblox kind of context, where like at no point does anyone at Roblox say, we want someone to make this obstacle course. Like it just happened that was what came out of it, right? Like a more organic and a more networked sense of an arising of content, as opposed to this like curated or broadcast mode where you have someone saying to themselves, you know, in a man's body, I should really put a female character in here. Let me write a female character, right? You know, or in a white body, I should really make this about a Black community. Let me write these characters, you know, like that seems to be something that used to be appropriate because we all had faith that that was the way things worked.
Yeah.
But I think that's not the way they work anymore, or they're so rapidly changing that we're realizing that that just makes us uncomfortable, you know?
Yeah.
Like you shouldn't do it that way.
It's kind of, it's just really energizing to kind of see the like constant like creative output from like just a community that is just kind of empowered to the point where they can just like get to the point of getting things out there at a and there's enough people out there doing that like the stream is just kind of constant, and you're just seeing new ideas just so rapidly. Because like, yeah, like going back to the old model, like that stuff cycles like really slowly. Like,
Yeah, it's like anciently slow. It feels like dinosaur slow.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, you'll get like an RFP from a publisher if you like are at a studio like where I have worked. It'll be something like, oh, we're looking for you to pitch us like I don't know, like a third-person shooter with this budget and these parameters, and kind of like about this, maybe, but just kind of, like
Yeah.
operate within these. And it's like, or they'll ask, like, it's going to have like a few features from this game that's really hot right now, and like, that game that was culturally relevant when that kind of exec wrote that is like, it's going to be 3 years down the line before this game that is influenced by it comes out. And that's just like, if everything is kind of running at that like snail's pace of things inspiring other things, then like, yeah, that's why you see weird AAA trends that last for so long.
Yeah, it's like
changing
hemlines or something. Like when we used to worry about whether you could wear white shoes after Memorial Day, or like hemlines were going up or going down, over a series of seasons. And like now suddenly everyone's like, what are you talking about? Everyone's wearing their shirt inside out. And also your sneakers should be 5 times the size of normal, but you can only wear them for like 6 months and then you have to get rid of them. We moved into that place. And I think that, I guess one of the things I'm really hopeful for as we move through this challenge, where we're starting to like really look at questions of like decolonialization and anti-racism and true gender parity and equality in our hiring and in our promotion. When we really start to have those conversations as a group, I think that games is probably one of the most elastic and fast changing, which is why we're seeing so much change right now and so much upheaval and so many conversations, because we are relatively quick compared to, say, the fashion industry or film, or, God forbid, Boeing, or like compared to most other industries. I actually think that we're incredibly elastic and we can change very quickly. But also because we're designers, like we have the capacity to imagine other worlds, right?
Yeah.
That's what we do for a living. So we should, if we really sat down and said to ourselves, okay, by 2030, we want parity across all companies based on the gender, racial, and class breakdown in any given place where a studio is located, if there is even such a thing as that anymore. I bet we could do it if we really put our minds to it. We invented so many other amazing things. And so I guess one of the things I wanted to ask you about is like, when you think about the future and you think like, oh, I can't imagine it, do you ever imagine yourself as like someone who might be authoring that stuff? Maybe it's too late for me, but it might not be too late for you. Like you're younger than me and you're just getting started, maybe you are one of the architects of that future.
Yeah, like, I had never thought about, that in those terms of like, I don't know about any of that. I've definitely like felt my own kind of like thoughts about where the industry should be like butting up against the actual like where we are right now, and being the person who like nudging at the edges for like greater representation within studios, within games, and just kind of doing internal advocacy stuff for all of that. Like, I've learned so much about just the way games as an industry operates just from doing that work, that I think if I had just been kind of like just doing the job, I think I would have maybe missed out on that kind of like, I don't know, and you have like questions about like, oh, how does that happen? And how does like, why are we like in the kind of state that we're in? And then like, you kind of pay attention to it and you kind of slowly start to answer those questions for yourself. I feel like that has been a super valuable experience of like having enough conversations with people inside those systems and trying to like, as a single person, do what I can to like move the needle on those kind of issues is like taught me a lot about like, okay, this is how large companies work, and this is how when you have a group of people who are all kind of well-meaning and have the right kind of sentiment, but not necessarily the resources or not necessarily the prioritization to actually make a thing happen, it just never happens. And that's
Yeah.
like, oh, that kind of makes sense. You kind of think of companies as like an entity that has like, it like the entity will make a decision or not make a decision, but really it's like a lot of people in the background who are striving for things and like getting it or not getting it, just kind of based on circumstances. And I feel like those circumstances are slowly changing. I mean, not kind of like fast enough for my like impatient liking, but like, I mean, and COVID, this is another thing we were talking about COVID like a little bit ago. Like that is for sure, like that having just kind of come up and forcing people into lockdown kind of out of nowhere, and companies having to like adapt to that just like very quickly, has definitely changed people's opinions on like remote working. And that in turn has changed, like loosened people's opinions on, okay, maybe we could hire people remotely, like just kind of going forward. And that in turn is just kind of broadening games to more people who are like have a non-standard needs for working hours, or kind of do not fit in the like traditional mold of like, I can work a 9 to 5, 40-hour week with some allowances for crunch every now and again because I don't have any kind of like things that would like demand anything of me. And that's like, I mean, like I'm talking around it, but like, yeah, it's like, it's like guys of a certain age who just don't have like other kind of reliable like stuff to, and like,
there's no reason to talk around it. I mean, I think that it's forcing us to look at, what everybody's burdens are, right? I mean, even just that guy, if he's married and has kids, suddenly now they're not just being taken care of by someone else, whether that someone else is a partner or someone they pay. Like suddenly those kids are at home.
Yeah.
That's like, oh, suddenly you're a caregiver now. And
that
in and of itself is such an empathy creating experience,
Yeah, and it's while it is frustrating that like we have to go through a pandemic for people to kind of, we can actually weird. It's actually not too bad. It's weird that we have to go through this to have like people feel differently about these things, but like it is going to, like when we come out of this, like it is going to be a positive in terms of the kinds of people who can just get a foot in the door now.
I think it's totally amazing in that way that like often, someone said to me, actually my co-founder Martin was saying to me over the weekend, there's always this idea of like the cool period, which is like a cool period in history is a place that you want to read about, but you don't want to be in it.
Oh yeah. I've learned about the cool zone. Yeah.
Yeah. We're in the cool zone right now and it feels terrible. Like it's super, super uncomfortable. Right. Yeah. And like this idea that we're in it, as designers, I think it's so fruitful to really ask yourself about these futures. And when I say like, do you think that maybe you could be an architect of the future? It's not like, oh, okay, Ben Wilson, like, you do it yourself. It's more like, it's actually kind of like, well, you actually probably have in this new future, maybe just as much input as many other people would have. And before you might have had less input because of the way that the power was distributed in a system, but maybe because everything's going to get a little bit flatter and we're going to get a little bit more open, maybe there is a push that happens just naturally by a large number of people that were activated through the lowering barrier in terms of tools and access and festivals and jams and all these things that happen. And that there's just like a switch, almost like the same way, like when you see a flock of birds, one starts calling and then they all call and then they all get up and fly away, right? Like, like maybe there's a signal boost that comes from the lowering of some of these barriers because of necessity and of people that had more time suddenly having less. Maybe there's a shift.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I totally... Yeah, you were saying like the thing about the cool zone is that you hate it's like a nightmare to be in it, but like it also feels like genuinely anything could happen, and that's like kind of there's a positive kind of aspect to that like, oh, we could come out of this just feeling way differently about things that were just kind of seen as like a given.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of exciting. And I'm like quietly hopeful that like, I mean, I'm leaving the studio that I've been working at the last couple of years just to I'm going to be joining a indie studio shortly, and also focusing on like solo work again because
Fantastic.
yeah, I mean, thanks. Yeah, it's been kind of time for a change for a little bit, and an opportunity came up, and I just it's time to do something new. But like, so I'm leaving that environment, and I'm kind of like, it's kind of bittersweet because like in that kind of AAA studio environment that I'm involved in, kind of all this kind of advocacy work in, like things are kind of, it feels like things are just kind of beginning to take off in terms of like things that have been spinning their wheels over the past like, year or longer are suddenly gaining traction because people are thinking about issues as like, oh, well, let's actually action some things, rather than let's just discuss it, or let's kind of talk about how we'd all like to do this, but it's kind of inconvenient, so nothing's going to happen. I think that like shift into, well, we've all had this kind of weird like upheaval and we're dealing with it, great. Like everybody is doing, like the people who are working here are kind of stable and still enjoying the work and are being supported, and we could do that, and what else can we do? So it's like really nice that those like issues are kind of, these conversations are happening and those issues are kind of gaining traction. But now I'm leaving.
Yeah,
so,
bittersweet.
I'm not going to be part of those conversations anymore. But like, it's like there's so many. It's a large studio, and there are so many people who are also like fighting this fight that like I don't need to be there really.
Well, and that's an interesting thing that, that I think a lot of people have been discussing on the sidelines as well. Like anyone in the industry who is a survivor, or anyone who is Black or Indigenous or a person of color who has experienced a lot of microaggressions at work, or, experienced unequal pay, or like ridiculous emotional labor requests, all the things that people are talking about now. Mm-hmm. There's a point at which you have to sort of ask yourself, like, how much can I do? And what, like, is this the tipping point where like I could have nudged it in the right direction and it just will gain its own momentum, versus, how much of this is my responsibility versus like how much is really like something that I could actually really make a concrete difference in. And these are like really difficult questions for anyone who's an advocate for any specific segment of person in any industry, right? Is like, okay, well, I can only do so much, right? And I got interested in this idea of like, there's this curve that exists in data with people when you ask them about their lives. Young people generally think that next year is going to be even better than this year, and that goes on for a long time. And then there gets to a point where everyone's like, things are okay. And then when you hit your 40s, it kind of starts to be like, yeah, actually, I thought I was going to get a lot more done on this planet than I actually have. And I think maybe this is it. Like, I'm starting to feel like I'm cresting into, my later years. And there's kind of a downturn in most data. And this is like true when you normalize for all different kinds of things until you hit 50. And then when you hit 50, you get more grateful, more content with what you've accomplished, and more positive about your relationships with other people because you've really settled into them. It's very typical for people to sort of have this malaise, which, some people call a midlife crisis, but essentially like a downturn where they're no longer as optimistic about the future as they used to be, but it goes away. And I'm actually kind of feeling like maybe we're all experiencing that right now, like as a group of people, because everything suddenly just got so hard to predict. Like it's very difficult to imagine that next year is going to be better than this year, because every month has been sort of significantly worse. Like it feels like a downward trend right now. And when you expose everyone on the planet to that kind of reality, that's a really interesting experience. Like when we come out of it on the other side, well, we have a ton of momentum. And then like, you can just focus on making the best games you want to make, because everyone else who was not concerned before is really concerned with making sure that their company is the best company it can be, and that they're reaching the broadest audiences possible, so that everybody is able to be paid a fair wage and healthcare. You know, like maybe there is an upward tick after the down. I don't know. I mean, I certainly hope so. I'm an optimist. I try to believe that's the case. But now that you're going to be focusing on this other stuff, like maybe that's just your phase, right? You're going to be in a different phase and doing different things. And I think it's really essential to kind of not take it on the whole time, right? You know, like,
yeah. Yeah. I definitely like have to remind myself that like, there are times where I take this stuff just very like, not personally, that's not the right word. I guess personally, but like, I feel like it's like my job to like kind of improve things for the people who come after me, and like let down the ladder for people who are like, well, maybe in my spot, but maybe didn't have my specific privileges of like, oh, just being able to take a year out to make games. What? And like, because like it is weird that like you go into kind of these like advocacy groups in industry, and it is kind of mostly people who kind of come from marginalized backgrounds, and people
they're doing labor.
Yeah, like doing kind of the work that they shouldn't really be doing, but nobody else is kind of has interest in doing it, even if they see it as important and noble or what have you. It's less of a like priority, and I think that's like a struggle that we've had for a while, that like that work is being done, but it's not like that it hasn't been anybody's top priority for a while. And now, I mean, I'm optimistic that that is shifting, that like,
you know, it's interesting if you think about it, the thing that you said earlier about resources. I think it's not just that it isn't necessarily being done by the people that it should be being done by, but it's being done on the fringes as well in those organizations with less money and less staff. And the goals, you know, the goals are always about, I mean, I used to joke about this all the time about, you know, I don't want to go to any more diversity lunches and eat diversity chicken and diversity salad and like have diversity Chardonnay with a bunch of other girls, or like people of color and like, you know, queer folks, and like be like, cheers, we're all struggling. Like those luncheons get really exhausting. I actually accepted an advocacy award a few years ago. And I said, you know, if you really want someone awesome who makes a huge difference up here on the stage next year, let's figure out a way to get this person to be a man who runs a publishing company or a games investment fund. Like that's who should be standing up here and being the advocate for us. Like why do we always have to advocate for ourselves? And like, I think it's a very hard thing to get done without a crisis. But you know, maybe because the idea of being at a company and working on games, it was always kind of like, well, you get to go to this like cool clubhouse and everyone there's talking about games and everyone has all this game stuff and like it's like really cool. Like now that stuff is all kind of on pause and it's just you're in your house working with other people through the internet, I think the focus is going to be very much on process. And so
and also like you know, the events of like the last like couple of months and the let's just say like, I guess, awakening of many people that kind of systemic inequality exists is meaning that like, I mean, I'm hoping anyway that like people realize that the invitations to that clubhouse haven't been distributed evenly, and
far
like,
from it.
Yeah. And that inaction is, you know, just kind of action that comes from assumptions, and inaction is working to keep these people out as much as actual malicious kind of intent. You don't see that. It's often people who like to think of themselves as inclusive, but are just not doing the work. And I feel like people have kind of been shocked into realizing that the work is not going to do itself.
Yeah, I'm a fan of saying, like, even just on gender stuff, which has been the thing that I've focused the most on early in my career, and then moving in through to phenomena, just like, you can't build an organization that's truly inclusive and diverse without asking about the policies and the sort of processes.
Sure.
And if it's taken someone like me 7 or 8 years to get to a place where I feel like finally we're making the right kinds of moves consistently, and we're able to have those difficult conversations consistently, like, if it's taken me that long, like, I feel bad for everybody who has to catch up all of a sudden. It's a lot of work.
Yeah. And like it is like, as you say, like learning to have those conversations, like that is like, it's like a muscle that you have to like build, learning to have the kind of conversations that will make you uncomfortable and being kind of okay with that, and being like having the kind of maturity to like just get through it and not avoid it or sideline it. And I still think that's a thing that is not, we're not there yet, at least like in my experience, but with hope will, that tide will start to turn, I hope. Like, I mean, I can only speak to like the rooms the rooms I've been in and the meetings that I've kind of been like involved in, but yeah, I'm hoping that stuff is kind of changing.
One hopes. When you look at your career, and you think about the phases that you've been through, I think that game designers go through these phases where you start off and you're trying to break in, and then eventually you find your people, and then you learn how to make what you love. And sometimes that happens inside an organization and sometimes it doesn't. But one of the most common things for designers is that we end up working on a lot of other things before we get to really make what we love. And you got to do it the other way around. You were not in games, and then you took a year off to sort of build what you love. And that built your portfolio so that you could break into the industry. And now you're going to be going off to doing personal work again. But in a studio context, like, that's a really awesome opportunity and time for any designer. But it's also very intimidating, because it's like, I mean, how do you get excited about it in this world that we live in right now? Like 2 years ago, this transition would feel very different than it does now. So how do you feel about like blossoming into this new part of your life, and how do you get energy from what's happening and stay positive and, like, I don't know, like, come up with new creative ideas? Because I feel like that's something that people are kind of struggling with in the midst of all of this other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of like something that working in the AAA work for hire studio space and working on jam games has like given me an appreciation of, is just like finding the joy in approaching each game as like a set of constraints that you've got to like work around and almost kind of puzzle through, as like, you've got your little like design box there of like, here are the edges and what can we do inside this kind of space. And I've kind of been fortunate enough to like, every project has kind of had different boxes in that way. And so it's always a new, like, there's always a new kind of joy to be derived from like, what's this one going to be all about? And like, where are the edges going to be with this one? And like, that saying of like, game design is like lighting candles in the dark. And it's just like really the thing that gives me energy is like coming to a game through its constraints, and you're almost like learning about the game as much as you are making it. You're kind of learning about this like big possibility space and narrowing it down as you go. And I just kind of love living in all of those kind of like possibilities, and like working with a team to like narrow that down and kind of sculpt it down into the thing that everybody agrees is like the thing that we can make and the thing that we kind of think is cool. And a lot of that stuff about like working in constraints is like, some of that is like not enjoyable in the moment, but you look back at it as like, oh, that was a really like that was kind of a tough one because we had these kind of curveballs and we didn't
Yeah.
expect this. And like, this thing would have been really cool, but we weren't allowed to do that thing. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it just, yeah, that stuff is energizing to me. And
maybe it can be energizing to all of us now, maybe, maybe this, we can sort of start to see what's happening with fresh eyes, and that it's not about, I know a friend of mine said, like, I need to approach 2020 from a different perspective than that I was robbed of my life, that like life I had planned out for myself got stolen, by this weird virus.
yeah.
And then all of the things that happened. And I was like, yeah, but think about how interesting the last 4 months has been compared to the last 20 in terms of just thinking about ourselves as a system and all of our impacts. I mean, we're thinking of ourselves finally as what we are, which is essentially very large ants on the surface of the earth. It's really true. Like,
yeah, you're not wrong.
It's great. Like, in some ways, it's like such a cosmic thing for everyone on the planet to be afraid of the same thing at the same time. Like, it's that kind of like in the terrible, like, mid 2000s movies where aliens come and we all like bond together as a society.
Yeah.
Like, that's what's happening right now, except for that it isn't really happening yet. And I think that's I don't know, it's an interesting idea to think about. Well, maybe in the next 8 months, we'll figure that out and we're really going to stamp this thing out and we're going to change the way we work and travel, and we're going to be a lot more kind to essential workers and start paying wages, and there'll be a minimum wage for everybody, like a universal basic income and healthcare. And like, I imagine that future rather than the children of men future, because it's like, I don't want to be the children of men. I don't want to be, I don't want that universe to be true. I want to be the children of women and men. I want to be the children of people, and I think it's just a very interesting idea that, that keeping that beginner's mindset from design is one of the ways that we can navigate through this really strange experience of wakening up in our own ways and then see others awakening as well. It's an interesting question, really, when you think about it from as a designer,
And like, as you were talking, I was kind of realizing that, like, I hadn't really thought about this until now, but like, during this weird, like, existence of living in lockdown, which we're nearing 100 days now here in the UK. I don't know what, I guess people went into lockdowns at different times, but
I went in the day after my birthday, so I've been in it since I turned 47. So my first experience of 47 was don't go outside.
Oh, yeah, happy birthday. But like, they say that like it doesn't get any less strange, it just feels less strange because the day before is more similar to than the one. I realized that I've kind of like in the back of my mind had a similar approach to like finding the joy in this kind of, I mean, I've been lucky enough to not be stricken by illness in this time. I've been like kind of unaffected by that side of it. My family have been fine and loved ones are fine, and so I've not had to kind of deal with any of the trauma and stuff, but like I've kind of had that same mindset of like, okay, here are the new parameters of just like living and what is like life like now, and how can I like derive joy from life in kind of a world where I'm not doing the same things that I usually do. And that's been like, I mean, it's like in a way kind of scratching that same itch of like finding the edges of the box, like lighting the candle in the dark, and like, it's been a really weird exercise that like in 30 years time, I don't know how we're going to explain 2020 to people who weren't in it.
Well, especially because so much of it feels like it was really strange before. I started reading about climate change in 2018 really aggressively because I was really trying to think about, the company and what we were doing and why we were doing it, and what did I want to contribute in the time that, I have left on the planet. And so I was already very worried about, climate change and weather and not being able to travel because of bad weather and, airplane flight becoming more and more expensive due to the change in cost of fossil fuels and all this stuff. And so I had been kind of running that simulation ahead of time, just in terms of a much larger system. But I was always expecting it to take 10 years to get really bad. I wasn't thinking about this moment. I mean, nobody could have predicted this, right? And like the fact that it happened, it kind of fast forwarded a lot of the stuff that we were talking about, even as a studio. But like, yeah, it's a very interesting thing to realize that like that process of making each day count and making each day like a conscious design towards that is a really it's a good way to cope, but it's also just like it's a good way to look at these larger systems and ask yourself, what could we be doing differently? Like if I wanted today to be better and you bump into a system that's really difficult for whatever reason, you can think about like, well, how would I change that? And what would be better, and what are the features of this constraint that I could maybe move around, right? And how could I hack around them? And maybe if we all get a little bit more hacky that way, we'll have some really genuine insights.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I definitely feel that as well.
Would be lovely.
Yeah, like we're talking about the cool zone, but like it just definitely feels like everything is on the table in terms of like the way we think about organizing our lives. And so it's quite nice that, yeah, I mean, I don't want to like, this is a kind of conflict with talking about like the kind of situation with COVID-19 and everything, because like you don't want to be like, oh, it's really like, we come out of it and it's like positive, and because like thousands of people have died and are suffering and are like really impacted by this like really dreadfully, and like those people won't have anything to say about like the benefits that come from. And so it's like, not at all saying like, oh, this is a net benefit really when you think about it, because of course not. But just having day-to-day living shaken up in such a way is, I feel like, I mean, personally, just like, it feels like what I've needed in terms of just the way I like think about my day-to-day. And it feels like an organizational level, the stuff I'm like talking about at work, it feels like that's like, I think that they needed in terms of changing their processes and reprioritizing their processes and thinking about processes as like malleable and flexible to kind of fit needs of, people, and not just, there because they're there. And
in a way, maybe it's like it gives everybody appreciation for how hard it is to be a designer, that suddenly all of the constraints that you used to have that made it very easy for you to funnel your energy and your time into these very specific things, have suddenly fallen away. And now you are in that space of the blank page a lot more often than you thought you ever would be, especially older people who have spent their lives kind of trying to narrow down on a specific set of choices and make their lives about a very specific set of opportunities, right? Like as you get older, you're really trying to find some kind of a flow, and to have that flow suddenly interrupted really does make you, it isn't just an opportunity. It is also like a burden. It is, if you have family members that are suffering, if you're losing people, or you have a partner that's an essential worker, or any of those things, like suddenly all those flows are now that much less organic, right? And it's much more about actually seeing them as a system as they are. And I don't know, maybe it can give everybody a sense of the true amount of labor that it takes to do the things that we always talk about, like, a peaceful world, like there's a society that contributes to NPR, and they say something like, for a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. Is there a
I've definitely heard that like kind of tag
and
on the side of This American Life or whatever.
It's like, okay, that's great, a more just, verdant, and peaceful world sounds amazing. I would love that. And like as I say that, like the only sound you can hear through my windows is ambulances and fire trucks and police cars right now in San Francisco. It's like I mean, it is a more verdant world in that there are fewer, cars around, but like there are cops everywhere. It's a very strange thing to sort of be in that space and sort of think like, what does it mean to make a more just, verdant, and peaceful world? What does it mean to build a better games industry? It's work, it's not it's design in a way.
Yeah. It's uncertain work, which I guess is like just like design. Yeah, it's work where you don't know what the end is.
Yeah. Lighting candles in the dark, as you said.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, Ben, and we wish you well, stay safe, and keep making great games.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.